Continue our look here at the peripheral nervous system and the autonomic side of the peripheral nervous system. And so we just got done talking about the divisions of the peripheral nervous system into sympathetics and parasympathetics. They then have, as they communicate from one cell to the other, we saw that we have a preganglionic and then a postganglionic neuron. And in order to communicate between one another, they have two different neurotransmitters that are the main neurotransmitters utilized. We have acetylcholine and norepinephrine. And so these transmitters are then released onto the next cell. And as they do so, there's essentially two potential outcomes. We can either increase activity as it goes to the next cell, or we can decrease that activity. And so we're going to either make it stimulate that activity, or we're going to inhibit activity as it comes to that next cell. It's all dependent upon the receptors on that target cell, whether it be another neuron or whether it be a effector organ that is going to determine whether we get a increase in activity or a decrease in activity. So are we stimulating that extra neuron, that next neuron, or are we inhibiting it? And so as it goes along, we have our preganglionic neuron. It comes along and it releases its neurotransmitter into the synapse. It binds to that postganglionic neuron. This neurotransmitter here in both sympathetics and parasympathetics is acetylcholine. And so the preganglionic neuron is releasing acetylcholine onto that postganglionic neuron. And then on our postganglionic neuron, our neurotransmitter over here in the next synapse at the effector organ is going to either be where we have either norepinephrine or acetylcholine. Not only are we going to have potentially two different neurotransmitters, the actual receptor then can be different as well. So we can get those different changes there occurring at the end of that cell. Where our neuron comes to our effector organ, the synapses are generated by these little varicosities here. And so we have kind of a little swelling in the axon, at the axon terminals there. And that is where we're going to release that neurotransmitter onto potentially several different cells at the same time. And so we're going to get that release occurring into that effector organ through those varicosities. Depending upon the type of receptor that we have, dictates the type of response that we get. And so we have either nicotinic receptors or muscarinic receptors. And so when acetylcholine is released, it's going to bind to one of two kinds of receptors, either a nicotinic type or a muscarinic type. They get their names based upon the chemicals that can bind to it. And so with nicotinic, these are similar to that of nicotine. And so the nicotine will bind to that type of receptor. For muscarinic ones, it actually comes from mushrooms, and mushrooms have, those that are poisonous anyway, some of them have a chemical that they release called muscarine, and this can then bind to those as well. So when acetylcholine binds to a nicotinic type of receptor, it's going to have an activating type of effect. It's going to be a stimulating effect on the effector organ itself. And so we're going to have activation. We're going to stimulate that next cell to do something. Versus the muscarinic type of receptor, this is going to inhibit. And so this is going to generally inhibit the effector depending upon the type of tissue that we're on. And that is especially so when we look at a cardiac muscle. And so in skeletal muscle, we use acetylcholine as well. And that's going to cause activation of the cell. It's going to be stimulating to it. Versus in cardiac muscle, it causes inhibition. Acetylcholine receptors in smooth muscle, and more specifically in that of the digestive tract, are going to cause increased contraction of those muscles. And so we get another different effect out of the same neurotransmitter, but different receptors give us different responses. So we have our parasympathetic pathway now. And in that parasympathetic pathway, once again, we get the release of acetylcholine from our preganglionic neuron. And then we come to our target tissues, and we're going to have acetylcholine released here as well. And then as it comes down to something like our cardiac muscle, and we have our muscarinic type of receptor, this is going to cause a decrease in activity. We're going to inhibit rather than excite our target cell at that point. And so it all depends upon the particular neurotransmitter as well as the combination of that receptor as to the type of outcome that we're going to get. Sympathetic receptors have one of two types of outcomes as well. And so we have either alphas or betas, depending upon the type of receptor that we have there. And in addition to that, we have either alpha 1s or beta and alpha 2s or beta 1s and beta 2s on these. And so these are going to bind our norepinephrine. And so for the most part, sympathetic receptors like norepinephrine in terms of the postganglionic neuron, and they're going to utilize this with the combination of our alphas and our beta receptors that are there. Alpha 1s are generally going to be stimulatory, so these are going to be excitatory. So alpha 1s stimulate, and alpha 2s inhibit. Beta 1s also are going to allow for stimulation, and beta 2s then inhibition. And so we're going to get the excitation of the heart when we have a sympathetic beta 1 receptor, and we're going to have an inhibition when we have a beta 2 receptor. This becomes rather important when we start to think about things like medications, because depending upon what type of a receptor that medication will bind to means that we may affect some organs and not others. And whereas we may have a particular desired effect in mind, if it ends up landing on one of these other receptors, we may end up having an adverse reaction. We have something that we don't want, and so we get a side effect. And so here we have our receptors here for our sympathetic pathway. And so the majority of our sympathetics are going to use norepinephrine. And so that norepinephrine comes out, and it's going to go to the majority of all of our tissues there on the sympathetic side. With few exceptions, we have acetylcholine as well, as it binds to those cells there. Primarily some of our things as far as sweat glands, some of our blood vessels, skeletal muscle. But for the majority of all of our other tissues, we're going to use that norepinephrine instead. And so two different processes there within the two. The sympathetic nervous system is going to be there when we have so-called fight or flight responses. And so with fight or flight responses, we have this potential danger there. There's some sort of emergency going on, something is happening at that period of time within the body where we're going to need all of those sympathetic responses we talked about before. And so we're going to need to get as much information in as possible, so we get pupillary dilation. We're going to get sweat, especially in those nervous areas, the palms, the hands, soles of the feet, our forehead, things like that. Increased heart rate. Get oxygen in by dilating the bronchioles. And then we're going to do our inhibitions. And so we're going to decrease digestion. We're going to decrease urine output and urine production, and also liberate glucose. And so we're going to have to convert glycogen over into glucose so that we have some energy for this response. These are typically going to be short-lived. We're only going to have to do this for a short amount of time. We don't want to be into this stress event over the long haul. And so sympathetics are not where we're at most of the time. This is for that fight or flight. We've either got to run or we've got to fight. And so this process is going to allow us to determine which one we're going to do at that time. In terms of things like the fight or flee, essentially for blood flow, we're going to pull blood back in towards the core. So we're going to have that pale appearance to the skin, get that blood flow moving out of the skin deeper into deeper tissues, get it over into places like the liver so we can convert that glycogen over into glucose, get it into the lungs so that we can increase our oxygen within the body, get it to our skeletal muscles, get it to our brain, increase the flow where we absolutely have to have that blood flow. So in some places when it comes to blood flow, we're going to get vasoconstriction, and in other places we're going to get a vasodilation. All depends upon what is needed at that particular time. Helping out the sympathetic nervous system, we have the adrenal glands. And so the adrenal glands, at their very core, we have the adrenal medulla, and it produces both norepinephrine and epinephrine. And so we may have heard of epinephrine before as being something to give when somebody's in something like anaphylactic shock, their heart is not functioning properly, things like that. We need to get their blood pressure up. The same thing is going to happen here with the epinephrine as well. It's going to be synergistic with the sympathetic nervous system. And then it's going to go and find postganglionic fibers and activate them. And so it's going to reinforce always the sympathetic nervous pathways themselves. It's going to increase their ability to function at any given time. So they're going to work in concert with one another. We're going to get the two functioning to increase that overall fight or flight response. The parasympathetic nervous system is there the majority of the time. And so this dominates. This is where we are most of the time because in a sense we're kind of mostly resting and digesting. This is what we're doing the majority of the time throughout our day. And so parasympathetics are going to be antagonistic to that of the sympathetic nervous system. So things are going to basically be the opposite of sympathetics. And so we're going to increase our digestion. We're going to increase flow to the kidneys. We're going to decrease heart rate. We're going to decrease breathing rate. We're going to decrease blood pressure. Get all of those other functions lowered so that we can get the blood supply to the digestive tract, to the kidneys, so we can do the things that we need to at that particular time. Essentially, all of our systems are dual innervated, and so we have a little bit of a parasympathetic input and then a sympathetic input to essentially when parasympathetics bring things up, sympathetics are going to bring them back down, or vice versa. Sympathetics bring things up, parasympathetics are going to bring them back down. So the one area where this is kind of odd in a sense is the salivary glands. And so the salivary glands themselves are innervated both by sympathetics and parasympathetics, but they both essentially cause production. And so they're both going to be an excitatory type of a glandular secretion there. It's what's going to change is the actual output that's there. So for parasympathetics, for things like digestion, we get more of a watery, enzyme-rich type of a saliva. Versus with sympathetics, fight or flight, we're going to have less water, and the amount of mucus that's in there is going to increase. So for sympathetics, we're going to get a thick, kind of dry saliva, versus parasympathetics, we're going to get a wet, kind of liquidy type of a saliva. Parasympathetics, better for digestion. Sympathetics, better for just kind of keeping the mouth from drying out. And so this is where you may have seen like an animal who's very angry, things like that. They're in that sympathetic mode, and they're getting this thick, kind of frothy type of a saliva being generated there. Or perhaps you've seen it even in a person. So parasympathetics, rest and digest, having a meal there, resting afterwards. Think of having your big turkey dinner for Thanksgiving, something like that, where afterwards all you want to do is just kind of rest and digest that meal, take a nap. And you think of other organisms, other animals, and they kind of do the same thing. They have a big meal and then they rest. They let it digest. They're not going out and running a marathon afterwards, something like that. And so all the opposites occur from what we had in sympathetics. Heart rate, breathing rate, all decrease. Increased digestion. We're going to have now constricted pupils. We don't need to get all the information in a sense that we need to for what's coming in or at us. It's not like there's imminent danger there or anything like that. So again, most of our organs have this dual control. There's both parasympathetics and sympathetics that go to those organs. One's going to bring things up, one's going to bring things down. And where this kind of changes, where we don't have kind of dual innervation, are generally going to be in things like arterioles and veins. They're going to be only sympathetics. Only the sympathetics are going to innervate them. So in order to change vessel diameter, to either constrict it or dilate it, what we have to do is change the sympathetic output. And so the amount of action potentials, if we're kind of monitoring action potentials, they're either going to change and go from many to relatively little, something like that, or vice versa. And so we're going to simply change the output, the number of action potentials that are being generated in order to change the size of those blood vessels. Sweat glands, same thing, only a sympathetic output. So this is going to be changed based upon the number of action potentials that are being generated by those sympathetic pathways. So when we look at the body kind of overall, we see that the organs themselves have a control by sympathetics as well as parasympathetics. So they're working against one another in kind of this push-pull type of a scenario. When one is active, it's going to inhibit the other and vice versa. And so in terms of the heart, sympathetics causing heart rate to go up, parasympathetics cause that heart rate to go down. And then they go back and forth and back and forth. Big output from sympathetics, all at once, affecting essentially all of these all at the same time, versus parasympathetics, perhaps we just affect digestion. We're going to only have digestion being increased at that time because we just had a meal. We don't have to affect the entire body all at once. And so this keeps our homeostatic balance in control at all times for the body.